Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session about school profiles. Don't don't get too excited. Don't jump up in your seat. Keep things calm. I know it's a very exciting topic, but actually, in all seriousness, I do think it can actually be a really great tool in terms of advocating for your students and just presenting your school and your community in the best light possible. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you can make the session live. And for those of you who are tuning into the recording and weren't able to come live, that's okay too. Hopefully you'll be able to feel equally as connected to the topic at hand from the comfort of your own home, at your own pace and your own speed. So just to introduce myself, if you haven't met me before, you might be like, where's Ethan? I'm not Ethan. I like to joke that I'm not the college essay guy, but I am a college essay guy. It's a pun on the Dos Equis man memes that you may remember from like 5 or so years ago. My references also are probably all going to be about 5 years ago or all older. So just prepare yourself for that as well. But my name is Tom Campbell. I use he, him pronouns. I joined College Essay Guy full time as our community manager. So part of my role as a community manager is producing webinars, live sessions, opportunities for our community, which is students, parents, counselors from all across the board, to have more touch points with folks who have expertise and background in the college admission process. My background is in selective admission. So after graduating from College of the Holy Cross, I did some postgraduate service work with young kids and families in Spokane, Washington through AmeriCorps. And then after that wrapped up, I started my admissions career at Holy Cross. I worked there for 2 years. It's an awesome school. Go Satyrs. And then I worked at Pomona College in Southern California for 4 years in the admissions office. So through those 6 years, read hundreds of different school profiles, have really kind of seen the gamut when it comes to the schools that are represented, not just in the US, but globally as well. I did read for the international team at Pomona. And then I also worked on the other side of the desk as a college counselor at an independent high school in Seattle. So I actually made my school's profile when I was there. It was something that for me was kind of exciting to do, actually, because I love design work. My background, if you really knew me, you know that I actually studied architecture in college and history. So it's kind of nice when you have opportunities to use like your graphic design skills and kind of like putting things together in a pretty nicely formatted way. So that's kind of something that I was able to do with a school profile, but I also know that that's not everyone's jam, which is why the theme of today's session is all about substance over style. I'd love in the chat to know if anyone is watching the British Baking Show right now, because the new season just was released. And even in the chat, you can either mention, I'd just love to get to know you all. So Jasmine, our wonderful moderator, is about to release a poll just to give me a sense for who's in the room. There's, about 50 plus of us today. So if you can answer the poll and just let me know who you are. We're expecting that the majority of attendees for this are public school counselors, but also you never know until we get the numbers. But yeah, no, Great British Baking Show. I'm not going to give any spoiler alerts to the show. But this particular season, fair enough, Griselda, about the problematicness of past seasons and past episodes for sure. So far this season, it's been, I'd say, a lot more palatable. But one of the themes of today's or this most recent episode was about there was a particular baker who was really struggling with, or a lot of them kind of struggle with like making their bakes really pretty, but not really having a lot of substance behind it or not actually tasting good. So the theme of today's session, even though it's about up-leveling your webinar or your school profile, and I love design things, I like when things look pretty, we're really going to be prioritizing the substance, the content that you're writing, and less how pretty it looks. I do have suggestions and tools at the end about how to do that, but first and foremost, making sure that the content is there and the content is relevant and helpful to people who are on the admission side of the desk is something that would be really, really hopefully beneficial with this webinar and that you take away with you. I also wanted to channel it for my own self because I put the slides together for this webinar like in the past 3 hours. And usually I like to spend a lot more time on that and make them look a lot more pretty with a lot more pictures. So in the spirit of substance over style, it's going to be a lot more bare bones, but hopefully the content is something that you can really take away with you and implement into your own practice as a counselor, no matter what kind of school you're tuning in from. The majority of the content is definitely going to be geared towards students or counselors who are working in public schools, particularly those who are working with a high percentage of students who identify as first generation, low income, and or students of color. This is particularly a very important topic for me because my mom is actually a public school teacher. I grew up actually, and my dad does nonprofit work in Haiti, building schools in Haiti for tuition-free schools for Haitian students. So I've been very present to educational inequality from my own experience, having had the privilege of being able to attend private schools, and the contrast to the school environment that my mom worked in day in and day out, and would come home and talk to us about various barriers that her students were facing in inner city Springfield, Massachusetts, which is very high crime, low SES, Title I school district. So definitely helping counselors and families and students who are coming from those backgrounds be able to communicate their lived experience and various barriers that may or may not be part of their experience to people on the other end who are receiving their applications and understanding them is something that I really care a lot about. So hopefully this content is helpful to you all. A few quick announcements before we dive into school profile related things. One is that if you are not aware of College Essay Guy's counselor resource page, it's something that is a real gem of a resource if you are not on it already. So if you aren't, Jasmine is going to share a link in the chat, and all these links will be emailed to you after we wrap up the session. But it has so many great free resources, opportunities as well for professional development workshops and student workshops in your own school. So kind of depending on your budget and the needs of your school, we really do try to have together a lot of resources ready for counselors, including like email templates that are plug and play based on like the grade level and the month of the year and relevant content and resources about applying to college that year. It's very, very comprehensive. And there's also a specific hub as well for public and charter school counselors in case that is particularly relevant to your population and the students that you're working with. So just wanted to give a quick plug for that and for all of our awesome workshops that we do in schools. I do that as well as part of my job, which is pretty fun. So yeah. Okay, so we'll get right into the content. All righty. So today's webinar is all about how and why to uplevel your school profile post-SCOTUS. So the big kind of like, I guess, this isn't really like a revelation, I would say. But in case you are wondering, can I have access to this content after the session is over? Yes, you can. As a matter of fact, pretty much every single slide in this session is directly pulled from a recent blog that we rolled out at College Essay Guy about 2 weeks ago. That's all about school profiles. So Jasmine will share that link in the chat right now. And honestly, like, if you have to tune out or leave, whatever, this blog really is going to cover very comprehensively a lot of the points that I'm going to share with you today. I wrote the blog in its entirety, as well as with a lot of different collaborators and folks on the admission side, other college counselors who work in schools that predominantly serve first-gen low-income students, students of color. So definitely a lot of collaborators, but this content is something that is pretty much all very comprehensively included in that blog. But sometimes it's nice to kind of have someone walk you through it rather than sifting through pages and pages of a blog on your own. So that is kind of why I'm here today, as well as to provide my admissions insights and perspectives. Definitely feel free as I'm presenting along to include any questions that you may have in the chat. Jasmine will be going ahead and collecting those, so that way we have, I can try to answer as many as possible towards the end of the session. But I'll kind of just go right through the content and then we'll see how much time we have left later on. Okay, so what we're going to try to cover today is, first of all, what a school profile is. 75%, according to a NACAC poll in 2020, 75% of high schools in the United States do have a school profile. So most likely the majority of you tuning in already do have some iteration of your profile. Your level of pride or enthusiasm about it may be otherwise, but most of you probably at least have something that you are sending along to colleges alongside the student's actual application. We'll also go into what should ideally be included in the school profile, including a research study from a wonderful researcher named Tara Nicola, who recently graduated from the Harvard School of Education, and one of her big parts of her research and her area of expertise is on school profiles and school context. And so as part of her, I believe, her doctoral research, she interviewed several different admissions officers about school and showed lots of different school profiles and basically synthesized their perspectives on what's useful to colleges. And I'll share with you a little bit of a summary of that report. We'll also touch on kind of why maybe revisiting or possibly putting in some addendas or tweaks to your profile might be really relevant at this point in time, given the SCOTUS decision. There is a lot of concrete guidance that both the US Department of Education and the US Department of Justice have provided to the public around how to navigate this decision and how to best support students who are coming from marginalized identities, especially in a time when it's very confusing as to what this decision really means. People hear about it on the news, and those of us who are not as well versed in the profession or reading the, dozens of pages of the actual Supreme Court decision may be scared or unaware of the best way to kind of go about talking about parts of your identity. So we can definitely cover a little bit about what could go where, whether it's a recommendation letter or a school profile, and where it makes the most sense to advocate for your students, depending on your job, the caseload that you have, how well you're able to get to know students personally. There's a lot of factors that make it a more nuanced issue, but hopefully you leave with some clarity about how to fold it into your own work. And then we'll also touch briefly on if you are coming from a high school where you feel like, oh, okay, it's great if you have like all these impressive colleges that students have enrolled in or these amazing high test scores, but like what if you're not coming from a school environment like that? I'll give you some concrete tips about what you can maybe include in your profile to ensure that ideally as many of your students can benefit from this contextual information as possible, but particularly for those of your students who are aspiring beyond kind of the typical route that students from your high school approach or are thinking about. That way they are getting a little bit more, I guess, they're not getting shortchanged as much in this process, as much as you possibly can, with providing some information about maybe resources they've taken advantage of or things that your school is doing to support those particularly motivated students. And then lastly, some design and efficiency tips, but again, they're all included in the blog. So we'll get right into it. Okay. So what is a school profile? As I've mentioned briefly before, a school profile is typically about a 1 to, I would say, 4-page PDF document that it feels so outdated that it's like even funny to like voice that out. I remember I had someone like read a copy of the blog who's not as well versed in college admissions just to get a second opinion. And they were like, is this really the way that they're doing it? Like a random PDF that each individual school designs and puts together their own way. And I'm like, yep. It is yet another remnant of our wonderful profession and process that doesn't always make sense. And yet here we are just trying to do the best that we can. So this document is completely customized by individual high schools. There is no kind of, template form necessarily that all high schools are expected to fill out to attach to their students' applications who are applying to various colleges. Typically, a school profile is sent to colleges through either a software like Naviance or Score or Maya Learning, or however you as a particular counselor are able to send this information along to colleges. It's typically sent to every college that your student applies to, unless the college specifically does not request this information or has an alternate way of receiving information about an individual school environment. And one of the most effective ways that I found to kind of clarify for counselors and just educators in general what a school profile is to kind of talk about how it relates to the 3 tiers of school advocacy at a lot of different colleges and universities. Of course, not all colleges require recommendation letters, but for particularly more selective colleges where I'd say the school profile has a really substantial amount of weight for students, it does tend to kind of really cover the where as to where a student lives, breathes, eats, sleeps, whether or not they're living and eating, sleeping, breathing at the school. But it really gives the sense of kind of where they're coming from in terms of their local environment, what the broader college going culture is like there, what the curriculum might be available at that particular high school, what does academic achievement or kind of postgraduate trends look like for that particular environment. So that way, the person who's reading the admission file on the other end can have a much better sense of where the student's coming from, what offerings and opportunities were available to them and were on the table, and what did they take advantage of as a student there. It's definitely not, I think one thing that I commonly hear and I think is definitely an understandable piece of concern is, sometimes if you look at school profiles from schools that have a ton of resources, it can feel like, gosh, my kids have no chance here, right? But speaking on the behalf of someone who worked in selective admissions, I actually think the more information you can include about your school, warts and all, is actually very beneficial to your students, because hiding sometimes that information to try and make your school maybe seem like it is more, for lack of a better phrase, kind of like further along in terms of sending lots and lots of students to four-year US colleges, it actually can sometimes be more helpful when you're really transparent about some of the challenges the school is facing or the challenges that your population is facing. Otherwise, the person on the other end reading the admission file may not know as much about that. They have other sources of information to gather that, but the school profile I would argue probably the best place to do that, because it is, obviously this isn't streamlined and it's kind of messy that every single school is doing this on their own with not as much guidance, but that also provides an opportunity to be able to really kind of take control of the narrative about your school and your community and make sure that to your students and your experiences that you've heard and witnessed as a counselor, as their advocate, that is being voiced somewhere and put into the fold as part of their candidacy. In terms of recommendation letters, the quick distinction here between the school profile and the letters, of course, is that the school profile is sent along for all of your students who are applying to various colleges and universities. Individual rec letters are much more of a chance, especially for the counselor letter, to talk about who the student is. Kind of like, think of yourself as like a secondary source, right? Like you're compiling like student questionnaire and maybe a parent questionnaire you may have, maybe some teacher comments from their homeroom teacher or their advisor. And you're kind of synthesizing and putting together a broad narrative about the student, their academic and personal goals, any particular challenges they may have experienced, any areas of impact or extracurricular leadership that they've developed as a student. And then the teachers, of course, most of you, I'm assuming, are counselors, so you're not probably writing as many teacher letters, but just that distinction, right, between who the student is, that secondary source synthesizer that you are, versus a teacher who really is a little more of like a primary source. And ideally with their teacher letter, giving a window into who the student is in a particular class environment. Are they the challenger in class that's constantly kind of like putting forward ideas or opinions that spark a lot of discussion? Are they the intellect who kind of like has those mic drop moments where they like say something that just like makes everyone silent and really think and just opens up a discussion in a different way? Are they the bridge builder? Are they connecting, lots of different groups and students in the class, setting up homework help sessions? Those are ideally all kind of anecdotes and experiences that, again, we're all coming from different schools. Myself right now, not actually from a school. So it's hard to know how much detail teachers are able to pour into their rec letters and how much effort they can put in. But ideally, kind of this kind of tiered system of advocacy for students, the where being the profile, the who being the counselor letter, and the teacher letter being the how, is probably the best way to go about that. Kind of just zooming in a little more on the profile here. These are for most US colleges and universities, especially those more selective colleges, many of them will be looking at these a combination of these three data points when it comes to learning more about the context that a student is coming from. Most colleges and universities operate some kind of form of system called territory management. So what this means is that you probably are familiar with this if you've had reps visit your high school, but it's usually an admissions representative who's supposed to be well-versed in the US state or region or country that your students are coming from. So it's their job to understand the curriculum, the different schools. For example, one of my former territories was Washington State. So I learned a lot about the Running Start curriculum, which was a chance for students in Washington State to take community college classes ahead of time prior to enrolling in college. So that's kind of really most admissions officers' jobs. And in terms of kind of like the volume, of course, of their work, right, a lot of them at some of these selective colleges are reading somewhere between 60 to 70 applications per day through the committee-based evaluation reading process. And of course, some of them are also really new to their individual college and university that they're working at. You may have seen a lot of turnover in the admission profession. The Great Resignation hit a lot of high schools as well as a lot of colleges. So the more and more kind of folks who are kind of in the mix who maybe haven't been visiting your high school year after year, maybe don't know as much about your school or student community, the more information you can provide to them, ideally the better. So in terms of these three things that you see right here, oftentimes individual high schools will be sending some combination of these three things: a school profile, which is typically designed entirely by the high school college counseling office or college and career center or school counselor in collaboration with principal, registrar, other folks on the school can get them relevant data about their students and their community. And then there's also the Common Application School Report, and other applications have a similar document like this where they have pre-filled questions that really do give you a sense of kind of the things that are most helpful to admissions officers, right? They want to know the grading scale. They want to know what type of curriculum is offered. They want to know what percent of students are going on to four-year colleges, information like that that really helps the admissions officer get a sense of what's available to the student and what the college going culture is like. So any of those questions, of course, are like, if you're filling them all out pretty comprehensively, you're already doing a real solid amount in terms of advocating for your students and giving admissions officers that clarity. But even more information can definitely be really helpful to them in this process too. And actually, College Board's landscape tool was developed out of that desire from admissions officers to learn more about the schools that students are coming from. So I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with this tool. It was really caused a kind of a big uproar in media, I'd say about maybe 4 years ago or so, around that time. It was a tool that was developed. Initially, the term for it, they used a term called the adversity score. Since then, the tool has been redeveloped, and they are not kind of capturing or synthesizing a student's level of challenge by one single metric and data point or adversity score. The tool is actually something that when I worked at Pomona College, we were actually one of the pilot schools to use it. So I was actually one of the first groups of admissions officers who was using this tool in conjunction with already existing information from high schools. And regardless of kind of your opinion of the tool, it is something that definitely does add additional layers of context when sometimes there's an occasional really scant, very bare bones school profile that is attached with the student's record. Sometimes, maybe it's a student from a rural town and they just don't really send a lot of kids to colleges or universities much outside of their home area. That might be a situation where the school profile is really, really thin. There's not really a lot to go off of. And so that College Board landscape tool definitely gave myself as an admissions officer more information. There's actually a quick little video about landscape, just so in case you're not familiar with it, you will in the next.
When making admissions decisions, colleges look.
You're muted, Tom.
And learn.
Oh, my bad. I thought if I was muted, it would still play. We're going to do it again with the sound.
When making admissions decisions, colleges look at a lot of things. Things like GPAs, essays, letters of recommendation, test scores, and they also look at an applicant's high school and neighborhood to consider what they've achieved in the context of where they've lived and learned. And this is becoming harder to do, with students sending more applications to more colleges than ever before. This year, colleges will receive more than 10 million applications from students attending nearly 30,000 high schools, meaning there's simply no way for any admissions officer to know every single one. Some schools and neighborhoods they'll know very well, others they'll know less about, and some will be places they don't know at all. In fact, a selection of admissions officers report they lack high school information for about 25% of all applications. This inconsistency means colleges can't view every applicant equally or give everyone a fair look, which is why they asked the College Board to help them find a better way. Working for 3 years with admissions officers from all over the country, the College Board developed Landscape, a resource that provides colleges with consistent school and neighborhood information for all applicants. It's what admissions officers said they need, all in one place. This includes basic high school stats, high school and neighborhood indicators that are aggregated based on where students live and learn, and how an applicant's test score compares to others who attend the same high school, which is the only individual information in Landscape. Everything else is general information, so the numbers are the same for applicants from the same high school and neighborhood. All of this information helps admissions officers make more informed decisions.
Okay, so yeah, and this is just to give you a sense a little bit. It's like another infographic of what landscape entails and the type of information that is included to an admissions team that's oftentimes loaded into Slate, which is their application reading management system, depending on where the individual student comes from, their high school. And then it also juxtaposes that with any information about their home locale. So using their kind of home zip code and address, the tool does kind of distinguish, for example, students who may be commuting. And we have this a lot. I think about particularly students. I remember my colleague, Ashley Pally, who now works at former colleague who now works at Caltech. She read files for the Chicagoland area, and she would often talk about how many students would be commuting to particular schools who lived in neighborhoods where it was very, very dangerous to be even commuting to school when the sun went down. So for them, they were a lot less involved in extracurricular activities than maybe other students in other regions of the country, because they were commuting far distances to their particular high school. And that particular commute also had a high level of danger when it came to going home later in the evening. So information like that is oftentimes something that, of course, Ashley, after visiting Chicago schools, was able to get a sense more and more of that. But especially when there are some newer admissions officers who are in these different offices, you want to kind of make sure that your school is being represented as comprehensively as possible. And one big critique of landscape, that many high school counselors and communities have voiced is that this is kind of using data, through the National Student Clearinghouse, through College Board's own data about test scores. So it's all publicly available information in a way that's easy and quick for admissions officers to read. But many, communities and counselors lamented that, hey, this is a tool that was kind of being developed without as much say and voice in terms of like what I'm actually seeing with my students and kind of that more qualitative side. So that's definitely where the school profile, it's hard to know how many colleges you send your applications to, student applications to, that use landscape. It is a free tool that College Board does offer, but not, of course, every college is using it. So the more you can kind of do on your own side to better position your students, the more advantageous it will be. So in terms of the key elements that should be included in a school profile, these are really the 4 areas that the study that I mentioned before, Tara Nicola's study, you can see it linked at the bottom there. And Jasmine can also include it in the chat as well in case you want to read through the study on your own. It's actually a pretty easy, for like an academic article, I'd say it's a pretty easy read. And it's really nice too, because it has lots of quotes from individual admissions officers, a few of which I've included in this presentation for you to get a sense of, okay, in these 4 areas, here are some examples from reading school profiles and just kind of particularities that came up in committee discussions where having more information in the profile would have been valuable for the student. So in general, you want to kind of have your profile cover these 4 key areas: academic curriculum, grading systems, post-secondary data, and school community in some way, shape, or form, depending on what information you have available. This is just a little more, specific data about from that study that I just mentioned. That gives you a sense of the few dozen, I believe, admissions officers who were interviewed, the percentage of them that agreed that certain particular elements of a school profile were highly advantageous. So as you can see here, by and large, especially when it comes to academic curriculum and grading systems, having a course listing available and having a curriculum overview are particularly helpful and kind of like, I'd say, at minimum areas that you want to be including in this profile. So that way admissions officers, aren't dinging your students for, oh, they didn't take this class, they didn't take calc. One of the admissions officers that was mentioned in the study was like, hey, we actually started to come across a lot more high schools than we thought that didn't actually offer calculus. And therefore we weren't penalizing the students or saying they should have taken calc instead, when it wasn't something that was even available in their own high school. And it's unfair to necessarily expect them to be taking it at a community college or having the college savviness to know other alternate pathways. There are, of course, things like Coursera, other ways that students can do that. But again, oftentimes those resources are tapped into by students and families who are more well-versed in the college landscape and process than especially students who are first generation to college, whose families may not know as much about particular courses that they may need for majors or programs or interests that they have. When it comes to grading systems, right? Also really important to just have the scale and the policy. It gets a little less important when it comes to like your ranking policy or GPA and grade distributions. Again, clearly, over half of the admissions officers sampled found those helpful, but by and large, at minimum, having your grading scale and whether it's weighted or unweighted and what that looks like at your particular school is definitely very helpful. When it comes to post-secondary data, this is interesting because most of the admissions officers who were interviewed talked about the college going rate being, for example, what they are referring to that is the percent of students who go on to particularly, I would say, 4-year colleges. It's great to kind of break down, 60% go to 4-year colleges, 30% go to 2-year, 20% go to trade school or, are pursuing other pathways, 10% go directly into workforce. Whatever that may be, that's definitely kind of, I'd say, the standard way that most high schools or many high schools will be communicating that kind of typical postgraduate outcome culture at your particular high school. And then beyond that, it kind of gets a little less important in terms of like yes, it's great to have a matriculation list. Yes, it's great to have testing data, but by and large, if you're going to have anything, kind of having a sense of where your students, what path is typical for most students who are graduating from your high school. So that way, if an admissions officer is reading a file from a student who is like looking at, you know, a kind of range of schools or a pathway that's really unconventional for the school environment, it automatically kind of communicates a degree of self-sufficiency, a degree of kind of being willing to kind of go against the grain and really advocate for their own goals, even if they're in an environment where that's not as commonly seen from their peers and something that they're talking about at the lunch table with everyone who's around them. And then lastly, school community. We'll kind of go into this a little bit more broadly. This is, I'd say, the most like unstructured section of a school profile. It looks a lot different from school to school to school. But I'd say touching on kind of some of the pieces that you see here, depending on the relevance to your own student population, is the best practice. So another tool that, again, Jasmine will share in the chat, and it's included on the blog. You'll get it in the email. So lots of ways to get this. Is NACAC put together a pretty comprehensive 4-year or a 4-page or so guide about school profiles, again, in conjunction with lots of different admission leaders at different colleges and universities and high school counselors. So it really kind of echoes a lot of the similar points to what I just shared before with Dr. Nicola's research. But it is something that if you kind of want a quick additional resource to point to with specific recommendations about what information is helpful, this is another great resource for that. So kind of just elaborating again on what I mentioned with the academic curriculum, some of the things that are really helpful to include are how popular advanced courses are at your school. So kind of a percent of participation of how many students are taking advantage of the AP classes, honors classes, IB classes. If you don't have those classes at all, of course, that's also really valuable to mention because there are many schools where that is the reality. Any information about tracking, this is particularly really helpful information to know, and something that I think you as counselors can definitely include as part of the profile, because there's not always as neat of a question on the Common App school report or other places. It's definitely not included in the College Board landscape, you know, demographic data, right? So this is a great example of something where your advocacy for students and including information about this is very helpful. I don't know if any of you have read the book called Despite the Best Intentions. It's a really awesome educational policy book, essentially about a highly racially diverse public high school in the Chicagoland area. But the book kind of unpacks like the underbelly of the school that a lot of people think, oh, it's this diverse school, everyone's getting along and this and that. And as we all know from our own adult lives, like that is not always the reality. So the school kind of unpacks a lot of barriers that particularly students of color face at the school, even while it's a diverse school and environment. It's particularly related to tracking for these advanced placement classes, not having kind of the approval to take these classes until it was a little bit too late, things along those lines. So if that sounds familiar to your school, or if that's something that you experience with your own school community, that can definitely be something where touching on that in some capacity in your profile can be very helpful. Another, anecdote you see here on the slide as well is if your school uses any unconventional names for particular classes. I've seen this many times where a school will use like foundational voices or something as an English class, and you'll be reading through the student's application and you're like, how do they not have 4 years of English? Like this is the graduation requirement in most US states. And then oftentimes you'll find, if you dig through the profile, that maybe there's a different name used to represent a core academic subject. Particularly at these more selective colleges, right? Admissions officers are looking to see that students ideally have classes in English, math, social studies, science, and sometimes a language class for 4 years of high school. That's not to say they have to, but that tends to be the course load that is the most palatable to the widest range of colleges and universities, and will make students as eligible as possible to be admissible on the from the academic front. So again, you do have a school where any weird names are used, that's helpful to clarify. For grading systems, again, the GPA scale that your school uses, if you use a narrative-based evaluation, there are places like, F.W. Parker schools, St. Anne's School in New York City. It's a school where there's only narrative written evaluations. And as an admissions officer, you might stumble upon the St. Anne profile and be like, lovely, this is gonna be a slow part of my day because we don't have any grades or transcript. We're gonna read a paragraph for each class that a student has taken and a narrative evaluation for all 4 years of high school. Those students do really well in terms of their outcomes and where they're headed and everything like that. But no matter kind of what scale you're using at your school, or if you don't have grades at all, some kind of sense, so that way the admissions officer knows who the top performers are, and who are the students who are doing a good job, but not necessarily quite at that top. Sometimes this can be a little bit of like a controversial, I don't know if I would say controversial, but a piece of advice that you might get mixed opinions on. My perspective though, and I think, as counselors, you may relate to this, like sometimes there are those students who are just total rock stars, who are like just crushing the game at the school. They're leading all these different causes and initiatives. They're doing amazing academically. And then there are students who like are fine. Like they're doing good. They're involved in a few clubs and activities. That's all well and good. So at certain high schools, every kid looks like they're that star performer because of how bad grade inflation has gotten, particularly at private high schools. They are, I'd say, statistically, there's a lot of research that proves this, more likely to have larger grade inflation than public school counterparts, particularly public schools that are Title I, public schools that serve predominantly FGLI students. So I'll actually show a school profile that does a great job at kind of underscoring their grading policy, why it is the way it is, and they kind of call out essentially the level of grade inflation that is experienced around a lot of different high schools. So something to keep in mind. Post-secondary outcomes. So again, a way to do this is definitely one easier way, if you have this easily accessible in terms of your own internal data, is to produce a matriculation list or a college acceptance list. Ideally, it's the places where the students actually enrolled. That is definitely, I'd say, the majority of the participants in the research indicated that they'd like to see where a student actually enrolls. But any information that you have around college options that students pursue in your community and kind of the norms around that is very helpful. So for example, I was just helping a former colleague of mine with her school profile, and she is from New Mexico, or her school's in New Mexico. And a lot of her students actually go further afield, and it's pretty unconventional for students from that high school to go, or from that region to go so far away for college, or particularly a lot of the students have a very high percentage of going to small liberal arts colleges. So she wanted to particularly include that to people on the admissions end to know, hey, these are kind of the unique patterns that we're seeing with our students when it comes to their college preferences, and their openness to maybe going to schools beyond the local area. I think especially in an era where many more schools are factoring in yieldability of students, how if a student is admitted, will they actually come and enroll it and attend? Sometimes more information that you have around college going culture can influence the way that the file is read in that capacity. And then the last one here is just, what are your student demographics, right? So, any information around race, gender, percentage of students on free and reduced lunch, languages spoken, if you have that information available. If you poll students as part of their junior questionnaire, that's definitely, I'd say, the most ideal time to collect some of this information that's helpful for your purposes in the college counseling office. Oftentimes that's helpful for rec letters to have those, surveys and questionnaires from students and families. But also a lot of this data can be sourced either through the National Center for Educational Statistics. You can look up pretty much any school on there and get a lot of this information right there. So if you're lacking it for whatever reason in your school community, looking online at the NCES data is a great way to kind of do that autonomously. But ideally, you can also get as much information, for example, around first generation status from student questionnaires that you receive as well. It's helpful to know, if students are part of a lottery for entrance for the school, if there's any particular things that they have to do prior to enrolling at the high school. That's definitely helpful to know. And then some of the things that you see here on the bottom of the screen, we'll unpack them a little more as we go along. So in terms of the, why would be revisiting your profile after the SCOTUS decision even be something that you want to add to your workload? The reason is because the ruling, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this particular document or this particular question and answer document at the bottom left of the screen. But this was released in August after the SCOTUS decision was finalized. And it provides guidance from the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Education around best practices for, understanding this ruling and understanding what is legally permissible and what is not permissible with this new legislation. So one of the key elements of the ruling that's mentioned in this question and answer document is that colleges can definitely still heavily factor in information about the students' lived experiences, and in particular their neighborhood and high school. So, given that this has been legally approved by the government to be a piece of source material to better understand where a student is coming from and fold that piece into their advocacy. That is something that will equip admissions officers with much more information. Particularly, it's not exclusively centered on race, because the ruling really clarifies that details around a student's race are allowed to be folded into their admissions conversation and candidacy if the student connects it to their unique qualities or character. That's kind of the way that the ruling has spelled out the impetus on students essentially to do that. Here's a little bit more further excerpts from this particular question and answer session about what is legally permissible for colleges to do to continue to bring in a diverse group of students who are coming from all walks of life. Especially since this ruling, statistically, it's very likely that this will impact a lot of the diversity on various US college campuses in a way that will not be as diverse as previous years. So the court is saying that these are essentially strategies that colleges can use legally to maintain and to bring in a diverse incoming first-year class. So as you can see, specifically kind of mentioning information that's typically included in a school profile has been kind of greenlit by the US government as a piece of source material. However, something that you may also be aware of, especially for students who are applying to colleges that have supplemental essays, is that over 55 colleges have rolled out supplemental essays that have some question along the lines of, its or college really values students from all walks of life. So please tell us about how your lived experiences or character or communities that you belong to will influence our campus or, have influenced your life and how you will contribute those to our college. That key word of contributing is something that's it's really tied to the language of the ruling. And again, it puts a really unfair burden on students to have to feel like not all students are necessarily going to know the rationale behind why these questions were put into place without particular guidance from someone who is more well-versed in the college admission landscape. And additionally, actually at Pomona, we did testing with our supplemental essay questions years before this ruling went into place because we were preparing for the likelihood of this happening. So we actually worked for years internally on our process to fold in with Art Coleman, who is the legal director of Education Council. A lot of colleges have gone to him as a go-to resource and person to help improve their admission processes so that they don't get sued around diversity and inclusion and their college admission reading process. So we did tests with our own student interns at Pomona, actually, of several different essay questions that asked students to talk about communities and identities that are part of them. And I remember one particular instance was a student chose to write about her Christian identity and her faith, although she was a underrepresented student of color at the same time simultaneously. We had a discussion kind of with the students about why you chose the communities that you chose. And she was like, hey, that's the one that's the most top of mind for me. I read the question. I'm really heavily involved in this. It doesn't mean these other parts of me are not important. Intersectionality is a real key part of DEI. So unfortunately, the way that this system is set up does not really guarantee that students are necessarily going to write communities, identities that are going to be factored into the students' conversation and candidacy in the ways that all colleges necessarily are hoping for. So because of that, that is kind of where you coming in as a school counselor can definitely really help with your school profile. So I wanted to actually just have a second for you to read this excerpt this is actually taken from, I don't know if any of you have looked up your high school on niche.com, but it can be a very revealing. I remember when I was interviewing for jobs as a college counselor, I looked up all the schools that I was applying to on Niche. And I looked up the reviews from students, and granted, they're kind of random people. And usually it shows you if it's a junior at the high school, if it's parent, alum, or whatever it is. But I'll just have you kind of read this excerpt from one student who wrote this testimonial about her experience at Dorsey High School in Los Angeles, which is a Title I school that predominantly serves Black and brown students. So reading over this, statement, it's definitely something that, information around like these lines can feel strange to include to colleges, because you're like, is it really good for them to know that like all of our computers are from 1995 and like the textbooks are really outdated? My answer, in my opinion, is yes. Because I think the more that an admissions officer knows the learning environment that a student is coming from, and particularly any obstacles that they've been able to overcome related to that, the better they're going to be able to advocate for that student in the committee room and conversation, especially now in this current era where information about school environment, regardless of race, whether it comes to funding, opportunities, is something that is legally permissible and available for admissions officers to fold into their rationale for a student's admission decision. And information like this as well, you know, this is from one student who worked at College Essay Guy, was a Questbridge student. This is actually from one of his supplemental essay responses, but it really does speak to, you know, some of the realities of many of the majority of the schools in the United States right now. So even if it's including, you know, quotes and testimonials that you have from students, that is fair game when it comes to school profiles. There is no legal like thing that is preventing you from including information that your students in your community have voiced to you or that you have seen when it comes to things along these lines. And I'll actually show a school profile that I think does a really good job of that in just a second. So kind of just unpacking this a little bit, the school profile can be a great place to talk about some of these different areas that are included in landscape. But again, you can put in your own words as an advocate in the school. So one example is I was talking with Carla Marquez. She's an awesome college and career counselor at Eagle Rock High School in Los Angeles, and she actually helped support this blog. She was talking about how recently the funding for Title I schools changed, and she used to be able to kind of take students on a college going trip and visit different campuses and do group tours. But because of these budget cuts, she wasn't able to do that. And I was like, that's great information to include in your school profile in some capacity, especially on that college going culture section. If you know, can say like, hey, our students, you know, have limited opportunities to visit colleges compared to peers at neighboring schools. Here's an example of what just happened that is making that issue even more significant. That is an example of a more qualitative piece of information that will be very difficult for someone at admissions to know if it's not included somewhere in the student's file. And if you put it in the profile, it will be included for all the students from your high school. You know, any information you have, again, and the way that you may want to do this will vary from school to school, but around, you know, if you are coming from a high school where there is a substantial immigrant population and that has influenced the college going preferences or culture that may be a reality of your students, that's something that can definitely be good to include. I see that budgeting, funding, staffing, and budgetary challenges is on here twice. Another one here is unique challenges related to COVID. I remember at Pomona, the last year that I worked there was the first year of the pandemic, and there was a student who actually included in her additional information section about how she had to take on extra work because her family lost their jobs during the pandemic, and she had to really kind of step away from her extracurriculars, and it impacted her academics to be able to make that happen. So if you know, are from a school environment where that happened to be a substantial portion of your students who had to take on additional responsibilities during the pandemic, and it did impact their academics, including information along those lines can be very, very helpful. A few other reasons that I kind of have already touched on, but I'll just recap here, is that more information on your profile, statistically, it does lead to better outcomes for students who come from first-gen low-income backgrounds, low SES backgrounds, based on a 2017 simulation by researchers on the college level. The students from this background were 26% more likely to gain admission when they had kind of adequate information, you know, more than that 25, you know, the landscape figure was 25% of admissions officers say that they're lacking information about applicants. This is another study that kind of proves that point. I've already talked about the high turnover, so that's definitely another reason to make sure your profile is up to date. And any, you know, say for example, the teacher who was teaching AP French was on maternity leave, and then there was no budget to hire anyone new. So if your school profile says AP French and a student's not taking it, you know, that could kind of be a situation or an example of where an updated profile that reflects the current reality of your teaching staff, the courses that are being taught, and it happens all the time. We'll have school profiles that have outdated course lists. So keeping that up to date is really, really beneficial when so much weight can be placed on what courses a student is taking advantage of. And then this last one, kind of about the ever-evolving demographic landscape of the US. Some of you may be tuning in from schools that are seeing a rapid shift in the last 10 years of your student demographics. So an admissions officer who may have been visiting there, or an admission team who has peripheral sense of, okay, we know that the New England states are a dying region and there's less and less high school students who are graduating there, and that everyone's moving to Texas, right? A lot of people in the college admissions and enrollment world know that. But one example that I like to point to from my family now lives in Maine, actually, in the town of Brunswick, Maine, and nearby in a city of Lewiston, where my mom actually used to teach. It has become a hub for Somali refugees. And Lewiston High School has rapidly shifted in the past 10 years to be a school that now is serving about over 30% of the students are actually coming from this refugee community. And so that has really, if you're kind of thinking of the school in Maine, which is actually statistically the state with the smallest percentage of Black individuals, you may not think of a school like Lewiston High School as a school that has a substantial population that is Black, right? So this is just an example of how sometimes, depending on how rapidly demographics shift, information about kind of like the current reality of what the school is looking like or is tracking towards can also be really helpful to include. So this is a profile that I think is really important to take a look through, and I realize that we're running short on time, but again, this is included in the blog. So this is a profile from Achievement First Hartford, and actually all of the Achievement First charter schools, it's a network of charter schools in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York. And they actually all use the same school profile template for all of their schools. There's a few things that I wanted to highlight about the particular profile that I think is relevant for those of you who are serving predominantly first-gen, low-income, and or students of color. So they actually, in the school overview, talk specifically about the mission of the school and who it is meant to serve. They have information about the student demographics that you see here on the left. They have helpful comparisons about the test scores and metrics along those lines from their students in comparison to national averages. But in particular, I really wanted to kind of point out how they actually explicitly write out how the particular college-going culture of their school is different than the majority of schools and communities that their students are coming from, the public school option, right? So they even make the distinction between even the class instruction. That's something that they made note as well, to just make that distinction for someone who works in admissions. What I mentioned before about grade inflation being particularly prevalent at private schools, Achievement First is including specifically in their profile, hey, you may be looking at our students and wondering why they have a few more Bs than maybe some other private schools in the area. This is the reason why. We're kind of giving you a rationale. Even a smaller kind of anecdotal, element like that can definitely be something that can be helpful to your students. They have a really great, again, most admissions officers like to see what courses are available. And they actually really lined it out really neatly here with kind of putting the first years, sophomores, juniors, and seniors right along in a line here of what's available given that class year and what options are there for the student to take advantage of. And then lastly, they have some specific resources and programs that they have particularly invested in to help build that college-going culture that they wanted to spotlight. And just kind of, making those comparisons between national statistics, perhaps state statistics, and what their students are achieving. Any of those kind of forms of, contextualization can definitely be things that can help position your students in a really great way. So again, this profile is included in the blog. I highly recommend you kind of look through it on your own time more thoroughly, because it definitely can be really, really a great one to model after. So for those of you who are coming from schools where you're like, hey, that's great Achievement First that you have achieved all these amazing things, but my school doesn't exactly look like that, right? It's a much smaller percentage of the overall student population who maybe are pursuing college options along those lines. So in that case, here are just a few examples of things that you can include in your profile to help distinguish opportunities and give essentially kind of credit to the students who, because the reality is when you're an admissions officer, at many different colleges and universities, if you're reading a school like a Phillips Exeter, right? It's a school that has a long storied history of sending students to a lot of elite colleges. At many colleges and universities, they would be more comfortable admitting a student in the 25th percentile at a school like Phillips Exeter than a student at some high schools with small percent of students who go on to 4 years, low average test scores, you know, they might feel less comfortable admitting a student outside the 25%. They may want a student who's in that top 5% because in terms of kind of, and there's actually new research that is proving that this is a little more of like an old way of thinking. But that is definitely something that I would say you see a lot on the admission end is the lower the percent of four-year colleges, typically the more they will feel that it is risky to admit students who are far outside the top GPA distribution and course distribution at that particular high school. So if that happens to be a school that you work at, a few of the kind of things that you see here on the screen might be good to include. You know, if you have any partnerships that your students are involved with an outside CBO, mentioning that CBO involvement or any of CBO involvement of, actually, there was a school that did this really, really well. It was actually Achievement First. In another version of their school profile for one of the other campuses, they talk about some of the outside programs that their students have been involved in, summer programs at different colleges, CBO programs that their students are involved in. So that can definitely be great to spotlight those and mention, you know, if you have a percent of how many students are participating in that, that's great to include. Things like Trio, Gear Up, Avid, of course, if those are things that your school is doing, great to kind of include that in your profile in some capacity and what that looks like in terms of their commitment. You know, if it's they meet an hour a week to go over all these various topics. Students who indicate that they're involved in Avid, this is what it looks like at our school. QuestBridge, same thing. If you have a lot of students who are applying through the QuestBridge application process and you're able to include, hey, this percentage of our students are applying to QuestBridge, we've had this many matches, things like that. That can also be another point to show admissions officers, hey, yes, statistically, 90-something% of these students are not necessarily aiming for these top tier colleges, but clearly there is a group of motivated students that's doing this that the school profile is informing us about, and we're going to feel more confident to admit these students given the precedent there. So these are some private school examples that for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over because again, the real spirit of this webinar was to try and equip as many counselors who predominantly working with FGLI and or students of color. But these profile examples are all included on the blog. And I think they give, especially when it comes to like the design perspective, a little more helpful. Some of them are just very clean and simple and streamlined. And it gives you a good sense of kind of how to lay out your information. I want to give a shout out again to Carla Marquez at Eagle Rock because this was her version when she started working at the school 2 years ago during the pandemic. This was the school profile on the left. And again, there was just lots of block paragraphs of text. It was kind of harder for the admissions officer to read and gather all this information. And so she worked actually with a graphic arts teacher. She was like, I begged them to do it. I talked to the principal to see if we could pay the teacher extra to do it. So if that gives you any inspiration in your own school community of a collaborator that you might be able to tap into to help put together a more graphically, you know, stylish school profile, even including a few more charts again around the student diversity. There's the kind of little mark of the IB school that you see on the bottom left or the bottom right corner, stats and facts that are kind of in larger numbers with these different blocks, and the profile goes along with lots of different helpful charts. This is an example of how even slightly tweaking, not necessarily the content, but slightly changing the style of something can be really beneficial. I always put this slide up or like to share this with people to say like charts are great, but there is such a thing as chart overload when like you're probably looking at this and being like, what does this even mean, right? I cropped out the name of the school because I didn't want to like put them on blast, but I would say carefully, you know, sorting together charts for a long list of courses, grade distributions that your students might be experiencing, matriculation list, kind of putting that in a neat list or chart. This kind of, I'd say, would represent a little bit of an overkill. This might be something for like an annual report to other powers at play, but not as much to a college admissions office because 75% of admissions officers admit to skimming through profiles, which I would say is probably like 90-something% if they're being more honest. So you don't want to kind of have that information be so thorny. And then again, this is recapped on the blog, but charts can definitely be really helpful. Section breaks to kind of have those big headers of like, you know, even those four areas. So, you know, academic curriculum, grading systems, post-secondary outcomes, school community. If you even want to have like 4 headers at minimum that kind of divide up that content, will really call attention to the admissions officer where they need to go to on the profile to source the information that's most helpful. So that was a lot of information, and I'm going to stick on for more time after since we've reached our hour time together to answer some of the questions that came in. Of course, no pressure to stay on if you are not able to tune into the Q&A. But if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to switch gears now to doing that to give you a little more information about that or about what you'd like to know. Okay. Okay, so there was one question from Karen that's, I'm an ISC and I'm a retired public school English teacher. I don't know what to do about a client school unwillingness to provide a school profile. It's an international school in Saudi Arabia, and they said to look on the website, which was updated in 2016. It's a very particular situation, Karen. I'm very happy to announce that we have a blog. We actually have a lot of students at College Essay Guy who come to us for support, who actually don't have a school profile. Their high school, we have kids who are coming from countries where they're like, we've never sent a kid to a US college. We have no information about this. So this blog was actually specifically written based on demand from that student population about, okay, what do you do if you go to a high school where they don't have a profile and they're being very reluctant to give you anything that you need? Unfortunately, the reality is that students can't really submit this on their own. They do need to kind of find, whether it's the principal, whether it's some administrator, someone that they can kind of go to find as much information as possible about their school. But if they want to go so far as helping craft a draft of the profile and then sending that to someone at the school and be like, hey, this is something that's required for US admission, the US admission process. Do you have any edits or things you want to include? Can you send this in on my behalf? Hopefully this is something that really does allow students to do that. Some schools do allow you, as you mentioned, some schools allow students to draft something and then they can upload it themselves. But in general, it's a little thorny there. Yeah.
They tried that, and the director said that it made them look bad because the girls' school and the boys' school are separate. So they said that the boys' school has clubs, so you can't say you don't have clubs.
Got it. Yeah.
So actually, I just put in the chat, Northwestern suggested they upload it with the additional information. They're getting so much. They said that the number of students in the school is confidential.
Yeah, it's really tricky when you're in an environment like that where you're just like, I'm just trying to follow directions here, and you're difficult to do so. I think your guidance is great. When in doubt, right? If a school is not going to be able to provide the information for you, sending that on your own accord, whether that's to the general admissions email account, to your regional representative, or through the additional information section, all of those are great additional places to provide your own, vantage point as a student if your school isn't doing that.
Thank you so much for answering.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Okay, so there's another question that's, do we have access to this information to know what information they have of our schools? Nitsu, that's a great question. So in terms of the College Board landscape information, I don't know if that's what the question was referring to, but that is information that is taken from the College Board's own data around test scores from the high school, as well as information from National Student Clearinghouse and the National Center of Educational Statistics. So those are things that you can theoretically look up online for the most part, even if you don't have access to the landscape tool itself. I wish I was looking for a little more samples of what to show you all of what the landscape dashboard looks like, because it is kind of just a cover sheet and page that outlines kind of all the metrics that were mentioned on the slide and in the video. But yeah, that's kind of generally what the landscape does entail. And because most of that is publicly accessible information that College Board has just kind of funneled and made look pretty and easy to read, it is information that you can typically find online through various data research sites. Yeah. So Doletta asked, are we able to get landscape report on our own schools? You might be able to even ask an individual admissions office if they're comfortable sharing that with you. If you're curious, if you're like, hey, I just want to know what's being said about me, you could potentially contact the College Board, or if you have an in with an admissions rep at a school that you really like, or visited your school that you two are just having a grand old time bonding about something unrelated to admissions, you might be able to kind of get them to be able to send you a screenshot or just information about your school from landscape, just out of your own curiosity. So you know maybe what are areas you may want to bolster on the school profile side. That's a great question. Next one is from Olivia. Would you list all courses or just AP and honors? How do you fit in such a large list of curriculum if including the standard courses? It's a great question. I would say in general, if your school profile goes over 4 pages, I would say that's kind of overkill. In fact, the NACAC guidance recommends keeping it under 3. I think it's okay to go to 4 because especially if you're, using page breaks and section breaks and charts, it kind of sometimes can be actually easier to read when you're not trying to cram so much into 3 pages just because a page, you're trying to save a page. Sometimes the extra page makes it easier for everyone. So when it comes to listing all the AP and honors classes, I do recommend listing all courses that are available in your school, even if you do think it's lengthy. And then particularly designating the levels of rigor, right? So if it goes from regular courses to honors courses to AP courses, you want to make sure that that's distinguished somewhere in your profile, whether it's using the highest level AP ones are bolded, honors are asterisks, however you kind of want to present that information, just making it clear that there are levels of difficulty that you as a school have determined these courses represent is the best practice there. In fact, at the school I used to work at, there was a little bit of ambiguity because all the departments had different terms for their courses. Some called them advanced, some called them honors. So there wasn't really any consistency of like, if someone was reading it and wasn't familiar with the school, they didn't really know if the advanced one was more difficult than the honors, because even between internal departments at the high school, they were not on the same page. So I worked on the profile to kind of try and really outline the differences between the different subjects. So if that, again, happens to be something that's a reality of your own school, and you're like always, and your students are coming to you being like, oh, is the admissions officer going to know that like this advanced topics course is actually harder than the honors one? Making sure your profile communicates that for the student, because they can, of course, put that in their own words in the additional info section, which many students will do. But having it in the profile can definitely be helpful too. What if we're at a new high school and don't have post-secondary data? How would that affect our student applications? Diana, that's a great question. I actually remember working with a school. So Lakeside School, the school I used to work at in Seattle, they had a kind of offshoot of the school called the Downtown School. That opened up, I think they actually just had their first graduating class 2 years ago. So they were in that position where they really didn't have a matriculation list. They didn't have, a sense of where students were going. In those capacities, of course, the first thing you want to mention is this is our first graduating class. This is when we were founded. You can maybe kind of put a sense of like, here are where our students are looking at, or other kind of information around. I'd say at that point, kind of average test scores, unfortunately, become a little bit of like a proxy for the matriculation list, because unfortunately, right, like if you have certain test score averages, it kind of just gives a general sense to the admissions officer of the level of selectivity that most students are probably looking into. So that might be a situation where for your particular school, any information that you have around academics that are a little more standardized, I'm a huge proponent of test optional personally, so I can't even believe I'm recommending this, because I actually tried to helped implement the process at Pomona, and Holy Cross was test optional. So I'm very well versed in that and really believe in it. But yeah, that's probably going to be something that will give your students as much of a sense on the admissions end of, okay, this is a new high school. We don't know as much about where the students are going, but here's at least some data that gives us some security in their preparedness to go to college. It might be similar recommendations for students who are homeschooled, right? Their school profile, the recommendation oftentimes for homeschool students is that including a little more standardized information is helpful, because there's not as much historical precedent about colleges they've gone to, and matriculation patterns and trends. This is how we add our curriculum. Is it okay? The picture and example on the next page. Yeah, so I see the picture that you sent in, and I think that actually totally works solid. I think having the way that you've outlined it with the different subjects, so history, English, math, and science, and then you include all the courses that are in it, I think you're doing it in a way that's really clean, really easy to read, and you're also clearly seeing like, this is an honors course, this is an AP course, and whatnot. So that works great. Student demographics specific to the school or the graduating class? JC, that's a great question. I would say demographics across the whole school is really helpful. If you do have, particularly for whatever reason, information, for example, like say you don't have information about the percent of students who are potentially first generation to college, maybe that's a data point that you as a college counseling team have access to based on your junior questionnaires. That might be an example of where class data about the graduating class is kind of disparately put out versus the overall racial and ethnic demographic data of the school, which should be accessible from your school administration or through NCES. Yeah. Is there best practice around font size? I love this question, especially if it'll be a PDF. So as a reader, you typically are kind of reading pages and you can zoom in pretty easily on them, but I would say kind of keeping it to above 10 would be my recommendation. I think any less than that makes it really, really tough. But sometimes, you know, if you want to keep it at like 12, like a typical like essay that a student might be sending in, that actually might be a little too big depending on how much information you're trying to include in your profile. So I'd say 10 and above is kind of usually for most readers going to be completely fine and will allow you to kind of parse out and make larger headers that's like size 14 and then the body can be 10 or whatever it may be. Best practice around the number of PDF pages. Yeah, Erica, that's a great question. I would say, you know, 3 to 4 pages makes a lot of sense. If it's less than that, that's okay. I'd say 4 is definitely the max. Beyond that, and it kind of tends to be maybe a lot more superfluous information about the school that's not as relevant. So Samuel asks, I heard that some schools require double spacing your words. Is that true on the Common App? That's a great question, Samuel. The Common App, actually, if you load in, I don't know if you're a student or not, or kind of what you're, who you are. But if you are working in the Common App and you put in text, actually, it kind of automatically for the reader, if you put it in as just like plain single space text, it actually automatically adds in paragraph breaks, for example, between, even though it may not look like it, if you press the PDF preview option in the Common App, you can see exactly how it will look to an admissions officer and what the spacing looks like and things along those lines. And the second part of your question, on the part about recommendation letters, I heard that small schools, especially in Africa, are not expected to produce outstanding recommendation letters, and it may seem like one is exaggerating. How do I address that since I come from a small school? Samuel, it's a great question. Mystery solved. It sounds like you are a student from Africa. I'm glad you tuned into this webinar. Hopefully some of what I shared with you was relevant because I know most of it was geared towards college counselors, but you're absolutely right. Yes, people in the college admission landscape are very familiar with the difference between recommendation letters domestically in the US and the level of, I guess, glowing praise that's kind of expected culturally in the US versus other parts of the world. So it's very common. I actually used to read admission files for Pomona for the continent of Africa. And it was very common for the recommendations to be very to the point, very much rooted in the students' academics, aptitude specifically. And they would be a little more honest, I'd say, in the rec letters than other on the US side, where there is, I think, a little more pressure to kind of have everyone sound really great. So I would say, I would not worry about that if I was you, because know that people on the admission end are going to be seeing tons of rec letters. And it's okay if they are, you know, glowing in praise. Sometimes, you know, certain schools, counselors have attended a workshop, a webinar, they have their own recommendation style. So it's not a huge uniform, you know, they're all going to look like that. But yes, it is statistically prevalent that recs from outside the US are less hyperbolic and glowing than the domestic ones. Hamza asks, any advice about how to include info about dual enrollment programs? Our juniors and seniors take all secular classes at different dual institutions. There's a huge and varied course catalog. That's a great question. You can include links in the school profile. It's not easy for an admissions officer to click on that. So I oftentimes recommend something like Linktree, or sometimes people will use like tiny URL or bit.ly. I'll type those in the chat just so you have them. Those are ways to kind of put links that are pretty reader friendly. And, you know, it could, if you also like bold or highlight it, and, you know, in Slate, a really common admissions reading and application management software, you can usually copy actually using a text cursor text and paste it into a web browser. So for example, if you have a really long course catalog of dual enrollment courses that your students are choosing between, you can maybe include some of the more popular ones or ones that are most statistically prevalent for your students on the profile. But for the sake of space, you can say for additional courses or the complete course catalog, you know, please visit this link. That'll give them at least a place to be able to find that information more readily, even if you're not including it on the profile, because that might make it longer than 4 pages. Great question. And then I think you should also make a video explaining how to write outstanding recommendation letters. I've used your guidance on writing my personal statement. By the way, I'm from Kenya. Hi, Anonymous. We actually do have a lot of content about recommendation letter writing. We do have a blog all about this. And I actually did a presentation at NACAC this past couple weeks ago on recommendation writing that is available on our collegeessayguide.com/NACAC website. So the presentation from that session and our resources and recordings and all the tips and advice are all included there, as well as a lot of other information that the College Essay Guide team put together at NACAC. So feel free to check that out if it's interesting to you. And then the last question here is for data pieces. Do we need to include links or cite sources of where data is collected and found? I wouldn't say I would worry about that quite as much. I don't think you need to do source data or citing of it. So I think for the sake of space and ease on your own end, as long as you know that they're accurate and you kind of source them from places that are reputable, you should be fair game, and you won't get like audited. I'm not gonna come back to you and be like, oh, come on, like where'd you get this figure? So great question. Alrighty, I think that's everything. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this information was valuable. And again, the blog is it explains everything in a lot more detail. And there's even more sample school profiles to look at if you want a little more design inspiration. We do also have templates as well. Some Canva templates if you decide you want to completely switch it up. Ethan was like, can you create like a AI generated school profile where they just have to put in the information and it spits out a beautifully designed thing? And I searched the internet far and wide. There are a few AI-based design publishers that make like little graphics, but I don't think we're quite at the point yet that we can automatically create school profiles. Who knows in the next 5 or so years if there'll be something a little more standardized. I hope that's the case because again, this is pretty unfair to expect schools to be designers and statisticians and narrators in addition to all the other responsibilities that you carry. So thank you so much for tuning in. I know this is a busy time of year, so thanks for making the time. And please continue to tune into College Essay Guide for more support with your work. Thanks again. Bye.